The winter air over Tokyo carried the faint hum of engines, a sound that once promised victory but now whispered desperation. By late 1944, Japan's skies were no longer their own. American B-29 bombers roamed above the clouds, and their silver silhouettes mocked the Japanese engineers below who watched helplessly as firestorms swallowed their cities. Inside a dim hangar at Tachikawa Air Arsenal, a handful of engineers gathered around the skeletal frame of a new machine. It was meant to be Japan's answer to the American P-51 Mustang. They called it the Ki-87, though some whispered a simpler name, the miracle that must fly. The air smelled of oil and cold metal. Tools clattered softly against concrete. A single bulb flickered above the half-built fuselage, throwing long shadows across the floor. The chief engineer, Lieutenant Colonel Masayoshi Tsuruno, stared at the blueprints pinned to the wall. He had seen the captured photographs of the P-51 Mustang, its sleek lines and perfect balance of power and grace. To him, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was proof that engineering genius could decide the fate of nations. And now Japan needed such genius more than ever. Radio static filled the room, carrying news from the front. Another island lost! Another squadron gone. Yet the men worked in silence, their hands steady despite the tremor of defeat outside. They scavenged parts from wrecked fighters, melted down aluminum from damaged bombers, and rewired instruments salvaged from forgotten prototypes. Every rivet, every bolt, carried a prayer that this aircraft might somehow change the tide. When the first prototype was wheeled out under the pale morning light, it looked magnificent. Sleek, narrow wings, a long nose, a powerful engine adapted from German designs. It seemed almost American, too elegant to belong to a nation now fighting for survival. Pilots watched with quiet admiration. For a moment, hope stirred again. If this plane could reach the altitudes of the B-29s, if it could climb fast enough, maybe the skies could be reclaimed. But the engineers knew the truth, buried beneath the paint. Japan lacked the materials for perfection. The metal alloys were brittle, the rivets inconsistent, the fuel dangerously impure. Every test flight would be a gamble between physics and faith. As mechanics tightened the final bolts, one of them whispered a prayer for the man who would take it up first. Outside, snow began to fall, slow, silent, and indifferent. In the cockpit, test pilot Captain Hideo Nakata adjusted his gloves and checked the trembling dials. The air around the runway shimmered with exhaust and frost. He pushed the throttle gently. The propeller spun faster, the roar growing until it drowned the whispers of the crowd. The Ki-87 rolled forward, its wheels bouncing lightly against the frozen ground. For a fleeting moment it lifted, smooth, graceful, promising. But high above, something unseen waited to betray that promise. The sky, vast and pale, held its breath. The Ki-87 climbed with surprising grace, its nose cutting through the thin morning air like a blade through fog. Captain Hideo Nakata kept his hands steady, every muscle tuned to the rhythm of the engine. Below him, the city of Tokyo stretched in silence, a patchwork of smoke and ruin. He had flown many planes before, the nimble Zero, the heavy Raiden, but this machine felt different. The controls were stiff, the wings too narrow, the vibrations harsher than he expected. Yet, for a moment, it felt like freedom. The sun broke through the clouds and glinted off the silver frame, making the aircraft look almost American, almost invincible. In the control tower, engineers watched through binoculars. Their breath fogged the glass. The sound of the engine echoed across the frozen airfield, uneven but powerful. Tsuruno stood silently beside the radio operator, his fingers pressed tightly against the table. He knew what the papers said. The war was lost. Yet seeing the Ki-87 rise into the light felt like defiance, a final whisper against inevitability. The radio crackled as Nakata's calm voice came through. Altitude 3,000. Engine stable. Temperature normal. Then a long pause. Climb rate falling slightly. The tower exchanged tense glances. Higher and higher the plane climbed, chasing the clouds where the B-29s usually ruled unchallenged. The air thinned, the metal strained, and a faint shudder began to travel through the fuselage. Nakata adjusted the throttle, feeling the aircraft resist. The gauges flickered. Oil pressure low, temperature rising. He felt sweat run down his neck despite the cold. Every vibration spoke a language he knew too well, a warning. Still he pushed on. Pride and duty fused into one single decision: prove it could fly. Inside the hangar, mechanics stood motionless, listening to the static grow heavier. One whispered a prayer to the ancestors. Another simply stared at the empty sky. Then came a sound, faint, sharp, unnatural. A metallic crack. Nakata's gloved hand tightened around the stick. The right wing trembled violently. The aircraft rolled slightly, recovered, then shook again. His training screamed to descend, but his heart refused. Not yet. Not before he showed them it could match the American masterpiece. He eased the plane level, forcing calm breaths. The horizon blurred with haze and sunlight. The Ki-87 groaned under its own weight. Rivets snapped one by one like faint echoes of distant gunfire. Then another sound, louder this time, as if the sky itself split open. Nakata saw the right wing twist unnaturally. A second later, the world tilted sideways, the cockpit filled with the shriek of tearing metal. He pulled the lever, but the stick jammed. Gravity seized him. From the ground, the spectators saw a single silver shape falling from the clouds, trailing fragments that glittered in the sun like scattered glass. No explosion, no fireball, just barked, just silence and descent. The radio went dead. The engineers stood frozen as the echo of the final scream faded into the wind. For a moment, no one moved. Then Tsuruno lowered his head. The dream had flown, but it would never land. The wreckage lay scattered in a quiet valley outside Tachikawa, where snow had settled like ash over twisted metal. The morning after the crash, soldiers marked the area with thin bamboo stakes, each one poking through the frost like a fragile monument. Captain Hideo Nakata's body had been recovered near the main fuselage. His parachute was never deployed. The engine, what remained of it, was half buried in the frozen ground, its propeller bent like a broken clock hand pointing nowhere. A faint smell of burnt oil lingered in the air, mixing with the damp cold. Lieutenant Colonel Tsuruno arrived just after sunrise. He walked without speaking, his boots crunching softly against the snow. The field was silent except for the slow creak of the wind through shattered metal. He crouched beside the wing that had failed, the one that had betrayed all their hopes. The aluminum had split along a crude weld, exposing jagged seams where factory shortcuts had replaced precision. His gloved hand brushed over the fracture, feeling the weakness that no amount of courage could hide. Japan was losing not just the war, but the ability to build dreams that could survive the sky. In the following days, the official report came from the Aviation Ministry. Structural failure due to stress overload at high altitude. Improper heat treatment of alloys. Lack of proper rivet bonding. The words were clinical, almost indifferent. No mention of Nakata's bravery. No mention of the desperation that had built the Ki-87 from scraps and willpower. Yet, in private meetings, the engineers spoke softly of what they had learned. The aerodynamics were promising. The concept was sound. But their resources, their factories, even their tools had been ground down by blockade and exhaustion. They could design beauty, but they could not manufacture perfection. At night, the hangar stood empty except for the half-finished second prototype. Its frame gleamed faintly under the lamps, surrounded by silence and cigarette smoke. Some wanted to abandon it, to save the remaining metal for other projects. But Tsuruno refused. He believed that one more test could redeem the failure. He ordered the team to rebuild, to reinforce the wings, to use every trick left in their worn notebooks. There was no command from above approving it, only a quiet defiance shared by men who refused to end their story on the ground. Outside, Tokyo's skies glowed faintly red from distant fires. The radio whispered nightly reports of new bombings, of cities erased from maps. Yet inside that hangar, the sound of hammers began again, faint but persistent. Each strike carried memory, grief, and stubborn hope. They worked until dawn, their hands raw, their faces pale from exhaustion. None spoke of the crash anymore. They spoke instead of lift, drag, and endurance, the language of those who still believed machines could fly, even when nations were falling. In that silence, something unexplainable grew. Not victory, not denial. Something smaller, purer, the need to try once more. even when the sky had already chosen its answer. By February 1945, the sound of distant explosions had become as familiar as the heartbeat of the city. Every dawn, columns of smoke rose beyond the hills, and every night, the glow of burning districts turned the horizon into a trembling orange sea. Inside the Tachikawa arsenal, the air smelled of oil, paper, and desperation. The second prototype of the Ki-87 stood ready, its silver body patched and strengthened, its wings reinforced with new rivets scavenged from grounded bombers. The mechanics called it the Ghost, not out of superstition, but because it had been born from the remains of things that once lived. Lieutenant Colonel Tsuruno moved through the hangar slowly, inspecting every detail. His eyes lingered on the metal joints where the last plane had failed. He had aged years in mere weeks, his face drawn thin from sleepless nights and unspoken guilt. Yet his hands were steady as he traced the lines of the fuselage. This version, he told himself, would hold. It had to. Around him, engineers whispered in quiet tones, their sentences clipped short by fatigue. They all knew that if this machine failed again, there would not be a third attempt. Outside, test pilot Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe adjusted his helmet beneath the gray sky. He had flown through fire before, against the Americans near Iwo Jima, against odds that no man should survive. But this flight was different. There would be no enemy waiting above. The danger was already inside the aircraft itself. The cold wind bit through his flight suit as he climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. He looked through the glass canopy at the men watching from below. None saluted. They simply waited in silence, their breath hanging in the morning air. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. Smoke rolled from the exhaust, swallowing the edges of the runway. Watanabe eased the throttle forward, the wheels trembling as the Ki-87 gathered speed. The nose lifted. The crowd held its breath. The aircraft rose into the winter light, steady and level. For the first time in weeks, Tsuruno exhaled. The Ghost was airborne. At 1,000 meters, the plane handled well. The radio carried Watanabe's voice, calm, deliberate, almost serene. Controls responsive. Temperature stable. Power adequate. He circled once above the field, wings glinting silver through the haze. Engineers clapped quietly, too afraid to celebrate aloud. Tsuruno closed his eyes for a moment and listened to the rhythm of the engine. It sounded healthy, confident, alive. Then the voice changed. A slight vibration. Climb continues, engine strain increasing. He could hear it, the same tremor, faint at first, like a warning whispered through the metal. The climb grew steeper. 5,000 meters. The radio crackled with static. Tsuruno leaned closer, gripping the table. The temperature gauge spiked, then steadied. The sky above the airfield grew whiter, fading into thin mist. The plane was now a small glint against the emptiness. For a long minute, nothing happened. Only the hum of the generator and the faint tapping of rain against the glass. Then came a sharp metallic shriek over the radio, followed by silence. The signal cut out completely. Everyone froze. Outside, the sky remained blank, indifferent. Tsuruno's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Somewhere above the clouds, a single decision was about to decide whether Japan still had hope, or whether even hope had limits it could not defy. The white sky above Tachikawa hung still and silent, a ceiling of light where sound went to die. Moments stretched like years as the radio hissed nothing but static. Then, faintly, a voice returned. Broken, distant, yet calm. Altitude 6,000. Slight vibration. Holding steady, it was Watanabe. He was still alive, still climbing. In the control tower, every man leaned closer to the speaker, afraid to breathe. The second Ki-87 was nearing the altitude where the B-29s hunted unseen. This was the test no Japanese aircraft had passed before. Watanabe's voice came again, quieter now. Controls stiff. Adjusting pitch. Then, after a pause, it returned, heavy with realization. Left wing flexing too much, he knew what that meant. He eased the throttle, but the vibration deepened. The reinforced rivets groaned under stress, the frame beginning to twist. The engineers could imagine it even without seeing, the invisible strain spreading through the skeleton of the aircraft like a whisper of failure traveling through bones. Tsuruno shouted into the microphone, ordering descent. The reply came slow. Understood. Beginning return, the descent began smoothly. For a brief moment, the radio steadied. They thought it might make it back. But then came the sound they feared most, a sharp crack, echoing through the transmission, followed by the roar of air tearing against metal. Watanabe's final words were almost inaudible. The left wing has gone. The rest was static. Far above, the Ki-87 rolled violently, its structure splitting apart under invisible pressure. Fragments spun like silver leaves against the pale sky. The fuselage tumbled, breaking into 2, then 3 pieces as gravity claimed what ambition had defied. No explosion marked its fall, only a distant rumble as the wreck struck the hillside outside the city. By the time search teams reached the valley, smoke had already faded. The wings lay half buried in mud, snapped clean near the root. Tsuruno arrived hours later, walking alone through the wreckage. He touched the torn metal, cold and sharp as truth. The investigation was short. The Ki-87's reinforced wings had held longer, but not long enough. The materials could not bear the stress of altitude. Japan had tried to recreate an American miracle with half the resources and none of the time. The dream had lifted twice, and twice the sky had refused it. In April, with factories in ruins and fuel nearly gone, the project was abandoned. The blueprints were stored away, sealed in dust, their promise left unfinished. Years later, after the war, when the world began to rebuild, a handful of surviving engineers revisited those drawings. They spoke quietly of what might have been, how close they had come to matching the perfection of the P-51 Mustang. Some believed that, given peace and proper tools, Japan could have rivaled even that masterpiece. But history does not bend for wishes. It moves on, leaving behind the echo of engines that almost changed everything. In that echo lived the sound of courage, men who built with what they did not have, who reached for the sky even as it broke their wings. The Ki-87 never became the legend they dreamed of, but its story endured, carried by silence, smoke, and the memory of those who dared to believe that one more flight might still be enough to touch the impossible.